Jeffrey Dahmer. On November 28, 1994, in Portage, Wisconsin, 34-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a morning cleaning detail inside Columbia Correctional Institution. He was serving multiple life sentences for the murders of 17 men and boys. It should have been a normal prison work assignment. It wasn't. Dahmer and two other inmates were escorted to clean the prison gym bathrooms. A correctional officer unlocked the area and briefly stepped away to retrieve supplies. Inside the room, the three men began cleaning separately. One of the inmates was Christopher Scarver. Scarver had also been convicted of murder. He had followed Dahmer's case closely. The crimes had made Dahmer one of the most hated prisoners in the United States. For several minutes, nothing unusual happened. Then the officer left the area completely. Scarver approached Dahmer. Witnesses later said the two men spoke briefly. Scarver was holding a metal bar taken from gym equipment. Then, without warning, he swung it. The first strike hit Dahmer in the head. Dahmer fell forward onto the floor. Scarver struck him again. Blood spread across the tile as Dahmer stopped moving. Minutes later, the officer returned. He found Dahmer lying on the floor. Scarver stood nearby. Paramedics attempted emergency treatment. Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital less than 1 hour later. Scarver later told investigators he believed he was carrying out God's judgment. The killing ended one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history, Israel Keyes. On December 2, 2012, in Anchorage, Alaska, 34-year-old Israel Keyes was being held inside a high-security cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had been arrested earlier that year after investigators linked him to the kidnapping and murder of an 18-year-old woman. It was supposed to be another routine day inside the jail. Keyes had already confessed to multiple killings across the United States. Investigators believed the true number of victims could be much higher. For weeks, federal agents interviewed him inside the jail. He described hidden kill kits buried in different states and explained how he traveled long distances to commit crimes. Inside the facility, Keyes remained under standard monitoring conditions. Correctional officers conducted routine checks along the cell block throughout the night. But during the early morning hours, something changed inside his cell. Keyes had obtained a small razor blade. He used it to cut deeply into his wrists. Blood began spreading across the floor of the cell. Then he twisted a bed sheet and tied it to a metal fixture above the bunk. The fabric tightened around his neck as his body collapsed beneath it. Hours later, during a routine security round, a guard approached the cell door and looked through the narrow observation window. Keyes was motionless. Officers rushed inside and attempted emergency aid. But it was too late. Israel Keyes was pronounced dead at age 34. His suicide ended the investigation before many of his crimes could be fully uncovered. Ted Bundy. On January 24, 1989, in Rayford, Florida, 42-year-old Theodore Ted Bundy was scheduled for execution at Florida State Prison. Bundy had been convicted of multiple murders linked to a nationwide killing spree during the 1970s. The execution had been scheduled for early that morning. Outside the prison, crowds gathered before sunrise. Some held signs. Others waited to witness the end of a case that had haunted the country for years. Inside the prison, guards escorted Bundy down a corridor toward the execution chamber. The chair waiting inside had a name: Old Sparky. Bundy was seated and strapped tightly into the wooden frame. Leather belts secured his arms, chest, and legs. Electrodes were attached to his shaved head and leg. A black hood was placed over his face. Witnesses filled the observation room behind reinforced glass. At 7:06 a.m., the execution signal was given. Electric current surged through the chair. Bundy's body jolted against the restraints. Smoke rose briefly from beneath the hood. Doctors entered the chamber minutes later. Ted Bundy was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. Outside the prison, the waiting crowd erupted in cheers. Some opened bottles of champagne. The execution closed one of the most infamous serial murder investigations in American criminal history. Pedro Rodriguez Filo. On March 5, 2023, in Mogi das Cruzes, Brazil, 68-year-old Pedro Rodrigues Filho was walking along a quiet street near his home. He had spent decades in prison for killing dozens of people. Filho was known in Brazil as Pedrinho Matador. He had admitted to killing criminals, gang members, and even his own father. His violent life had begun in the late 1960s and continued for years inside and outside prison walls. After serving more than 40 years behind bars, he was released in 2018. In later years, he occasionally appeared in online interviews discussing his past. That afternoon, he walked along a residential sidewalk in a quiet neighborhood. Traffic moved slowly through the street. Homes stood behind tall gates and walls. Then, a black car approached from behind. It slowed as it pulled up beside him. Two gunmen stepped out. They opened fire immediately. Multiple shots echoed through the street. Filho collapsed onto the pavement. Witnesses nearby ran for cover as the gunmen returned to the car and sped away. Emergency responders arrived soon after. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was pronounced dead at the scene. Police later opened an investigation into the attack. His death marked the violent end of one of Brazil's most notorious killers, Harold Shipman. On January 13, 2004, in Wakefield, England, 57-year-old Harold Shipman was inside his cell at Wakefield Prison. Shipman had been convicted of murdering 15 of his patients while working as a general practitioner. Investigators later concluded the true number of victims could be far higher. Shipman had spent several years inside the high-security prison following his conviction in 2000. The facility operated under strict routines. Prisoners remained locked in their cells overnight while guards carried out regular checks along the corridors. Shipman remained alone inside his small cell. During the early morning hours, Shipman began preparing a bedsheet. He tied one end of the cloth to the metal bars near the window. The other end formed a loop. He placed the fabric around his neck. Hours later, officers began their morning security round. A guard approached Shipman's cell and looked through the narrow observation window. Shipman was hanging motionless beside the bed. The officer immediately called for assistance. Staff rushed into the cell and attempted emergency aid. Guards called for medical staff. Their efforts failed. Harold Shipman was pronounced dead later that morning at age 57. His death occurred just one day before his 58th birthday. The suicide ended the life of one of Britain's most notorious serial killers, Andrei Chikatilo. On February 14, 1994, in Novocherkassk, Russia, 57-year-old Andrei Chikatilo was taken from his prison cell to an execution room inside a detention facility. He had been convicted of murdering more than 50 victims across the Soviet Union. The process was carried out quietly. Chikatilo had confessed to a long series of murders committed between 1978 and 1990. His trial became one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Soviet history. The court found him responsible for dozens of killings across several regions. On the morning of the execution, guards opened his cell and ordered him to stand. They escorted him down a narrow corridor inside the detention facility. The room waiting at the end was small and plain. A single officer stood inside. Chikatilo was positioned against the wall. He was not placed in a chair. There were no witnesses present. Then, an executioner stepped forward and raised a pistol. A single shot was fired into the back of Chikatilo's head. The execution was immediate. Andrei Chikatilo died instantly. News of the execution was later confirmed by Russian authorities. His death closed the case of the most prolific serial killer in Soviet history.